Welcome to Focus Today. I'm your host, Perry Atkinson, and what a delight and an honor to have with us today Katie Pavlich. She's the news editor of townhall.com. You probably have seen her on Fox and Fox Business, MSNBC. She's authored a book that you need to read. It's called Fast and Furious, Barack Obama's Bloodiest Scandal and its Seamless Cover-Up. And let me encourage you, there's a picture of it on the screen. It's put out by Rigoneri. Get a copy of this book and read it. This is one of the most incredible scandals I think we've ever seen with a president, and yet it's seemingly now out of the news, but she's very much involved in it. Katie, nice to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Well, incredible work. I know that you've been one of the top investigative reporters on this, and you've been following this story for quite some time. Why is Fast and Furious so damaging to the Obama administration?
Well, I call Fast and Furious a scandal with many scandals underneath its big scandal umbrella. There are multiple reasons why this scandal would be so devastating to President Obama, but the first being, of course, that people have been killed here. This all blew up when Brian Terry, Special Forces Border Patrol agent, was killed. The Mexican Attorney General has said at least 300 people in Mexico, and that's a very small number considering you can't really tell how many murders have been committed with these weapons that were flooded into Mexico unless they're left at their crime scenes. The bottom line is people have been killed here. The president isn't taking responsibility for it, and he sure isn't holding his attorney general, who's in charge of the department that allowed this to happen, accountable either.
All right, let's go back to the beginning of the actual scandal itself. And we actually sold the guns to Mexico, and one of those guns did kill Terry. Fill in the blanks there. What happened? What is this scandal for those who are just now tuning in?
The Justice Department and ATF, they claimed that they wanted to allow guns to be purchased by straw purchasers so they could track them. They could, link them to higher up cartel members, the big fish as they called them, in the cartel in order to take down the cartel network. But the problem is that they sent 2,500 weapons across the border into Mexico where they have no jurisdiction, didn't tell the Mexican government that they were doing it, and didn't make any serious efforts to track these guns in the first place. Now, the reason this came to fruition is two of these guns were found and linked back to a gun shop that was forced to sell these guns to the cartels in Brian Terry's murder. So two of the weapons that were used to kill him actually were provided to his killers under a program run by the U.S. Department of Justice.
Wow. So why isn't this case getting more traction?
Well, a couple reasons. The press is defending their man until November. They know that this would be devastating to President Obama in his quest for a second term. This is worse than Iran-Contra, worse than Watergate by far, and yet they aren't attacking it in the way that they would attack a scandal in any other administration. They know how bad it is, and they know that if they were to actually dig in deep, as a handful of journalists and reporters have, that he would not be getting a second term in November, and that his closest cabinet members, including Eric Holder and Janet Napolitano, could possibly face criminal charges, which of course they don't want that to happen because it would embarrass the president as an administration.
All right. Now, as bad as this is, there's been a little bit some good come out of it, and that is that it certainly turned the lights on the problems of the border security. I think that we know that Governor Brewer and others down along the Mexican border are just such odds with this president and this administration over the border problem. I don't think any of us realize how serious and how dangerous it is down there.
And I don't think they do either. I'm from Arizona. I grew up there. I went on a ride along with the Pinal County Sheriff's Department SWAT team a couple months ago. And there are areas of America now where you can't pull over on the side of the road, even in the middle of the day, because you'll be robbed, you'll be beaten, your car will be stolen. And the fact that this government, this administration was willing and knowingly allowing these guns, 2,500 of them, that's enough to arm a a Marine regiment that, high-powered weapons like AK-47s, 50 caliber rifles. The idea that they would send these guns into Mexico, knowing these cartels control parts of Arizona, control parts of Texas, the fact that they didn't even think about, well, unless they did think about it, that these guns would show up on the north side of the Mexican border is asinine. I mean, we have our brave Border Patrol agents and law enforcement, local sheriff departments, police officers working that area night and day. And Brian Terry is a perfect example of how it went absolutely wrong. Not to mention, in the book I talk about when Representative Gabrielle Giffords was shot, a lot of these ATF agents had, this terrible feeling that maybe one of the guns that was used to shoot her was actually one of the guns that they allowed to walk. I mean, the idea that they thought this wouldn't come back to hit us in America is ridiculous. Not to mention, it's awful that they would think it's okay that it just happens in Mexico so long as it doesn't happen in the United States.
All right, let's do some timeline here, Katie. How did this all start? I mean, some were put in the order for the gun. Where did it all start?
Right. So, I go back to the beginning of the Obama administration, starting early April 2009, when President Obama gave direct orders to Attorney General Eric Holder to reassess the gun trafficking and border policies on the southern border with Mexico. At that time, he was pushing this 90% figure, along with Eric Holder and Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that 90% of guns in Mexico actually come from American gun shops, America. But that's actually not the case. Our own State Department WikiLeaks cables that were released by WikiLeaks show that these cartels aren't getting their guns in America. They're getting them from China, Central America. And the ones that trace back to America are actually sold to the Mexican army by the State Department. And because the Mexican government is so corrupt, they're, of course, walked off these bases on a regular basis. And these cartels are going to get their hands on them. But do they distinguish the difference between the government-issued guns and the gun shop guns? No, of course. They just paint this as a problem with, the Second Amendment lovers in this country who make a living off of law-abiding gun dealership. So Fast and Furious officially started a couple months later in the fall of 2009, and they claimed that their initial goal, once again, was to track these guns into Mexico, to bring down the big fish, but they weren't arresting anyone. They allowed these straw purchasers to buy hundreds of guns. All the while, we have emails in the book, we have whistleblower testimony and sources and interviews saying, look, we set these gun shops up. The entire goal from the beginning was to make sure that we could prove the point that these guns were coming from American gun shops, ending up at violent crime scenes in Mexico in order to turn right around and solve the crisis we created with more gun regulation on these law-abiding gun dealers who the entire time were skeptical of the program, saying, we're not really sure we like this. Are you sure you're arresting these guys, that these guns aren't falling into the wrong hands? And they were told that, oh, absolutely, everything's under control. Don't worry about it, when all along these guns were going into Mexico.
Katie Pavlich is with us today. We're talking about this incredible scandal of the Obama administration, and most importantly, why it's not making headlines again yet today, even though we're in an election cycle. Some of these things become pretty obvious. But Katie, you were sharing with us before the break the timeline, and I guess what I'm having a hard time, like most Americans, getting our brain around is that our own State Department not only provided these guns, but set up the gun shops, the whole 9 yards, to supposedly go after the big fish, when in fact there was another ulterior motive behind that, and that probably was the Obama's administration to go after the NRA and the Second Amendment people. Is that correct?
Right. And it was actually, just a quick correction, it was the Justice Department flooding these guns
Excuse me. Okay.
Right. But the State Department was making these claims that, all the guns in Mexico were coming from the United States, which was false.
Right.
Looking at the motives behind this, I'm going to give you an example of it. And in the book, I really dive into the backgrounds of these people. Throughout this process, we've heard of DOJ, DHS, FBI, State Department, White House, but really haven't heard a whole lot about who these people are, what are their names, what are their backgrounds, who have they been associated with in the past. And one key person who is very important to this whole thing is former Arizona U.S. Attorney Dennis Burke. Now, Dennis Burke was in charge of the U.S. Attorney's Office that was in full approval of Operation Fast and Furious tactics, full approval of gun walking techniques, was telling ATF agents on the ground not to arrest any of these straw purchasers, that they didn't have cases despite watching them buy hundreds of guns, that they didn't have a clear enough case to prosecute them. Dennis Burke served as Janet Napolitano, who is, of course, the Homeland Security Secretary now, served as her staffer when she was the Arizona State Attorney General.
Wow.
And he actually was her chief of staff during her time as governor for 7 years, and followed her into the Obama administration as her senior Homeland Security advisor. And then President Obama, because he knows that personnel is policy, appointed him to be the U.S. Attorney in Arizona for one reason and one reason only. It just so happens that former U.S. Attorney Dennis Burke helped to craft the Clinton assault weapons ban legislation with Rahm Emanuel. It also so happens that Dennis Burke has connections to Chicago, as does Rahm Emanuel. And Rahm Emanuel, of course, served as President Obama's White House chief of staff. Now, how does this connect to Eric Holder? Dennis Burke, at the same time he was serving as U.S. Attorney in Arizona, overseeing Operation Fast and Furious, was sitting on Attorney General Eric Holder's advisory board, giving him direct advice as to what gun trafficking on the border and border security policy.
Whoa.
So they're all connected in this big tangled web of loyalty that goes back to the Clinton administration. And don't forget that, in my book, I open up with Jay Dobbins, who is an ATF veteran. He was the one who went undercover with the Hells Angels. And he said, our agency used to be all about simply enforcing firearms laws, not creating new policy through our agency. Well, when did the turn kind of change? Well, it happened after Ruby Ridge and Waco. And who was in charge then? Oh, that was Janet Reno. And guess who served under Janet Reno? That would be Eric Holder.
Wow.
So here we are in the year 2009, when the Obama administration takes office. Eric Holder learned all of his dirty tricks from Janet Reno, was heavily involved in the anti-gun industry, always expresses anti-gun sentiments, and now he's in charge of the Justice Department running this operation.
As a side note, you must be frustrated beyond measure. You've done the homework, you've written the book, you've watched this thing unfold, you've connected the dots, and nothing's being done.
True, but this is the problem. I have faith, and Representative and Chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Darrell Issa, has done a phenomenal job at doing what he can. I mean, the Justice Department has, and this goes to the bigger picture of, like I said, the scandal within the scandal. They have done everything at every turn to act guilty instead of innocent, in the sense of they're not giving up any information. They keep citing an internal investigation by the Department of Justice Inspector General, who just so happens to have worked for Eric Holder during his time as U.S. Attorney in Washington, D.C. So we're not going to see a fair, balanced, and factual report on that. My sources tell me that they're waiting for an IG report that they can all agree on, not one that's necessarily factual about Operation Fast and Furious. And so the problem here is, look, I travel a lot. I talk to a lot of people. The scandal speaks for itself. You don't have to exaggerate it. You don't have to, all you have to say is what the facts are, in the sense that the U.S. government, under leadership of President Obama, sent guns deliberately into Mexico to prove a point, to use humans as collateral damage, to prove their point that they wanted to regulate these gun dealers in America because they're so hell-bent on getting their political agenda through. Not enough people know about this. So the reason I wrote this book is to bring justice to Brian Terry, the nameless, faceless people in Mexico. Right. It's all about spreading the word. There's nothing more powerful than the American people and their voice.
All right. Now, let's come back to some of the other connecting of the dots. Is there any evidence back to the president's desk himself?
Well, we can look at the people surrounding him, his White House national security advisors. And remember, he made this a top priority at the beginning of his administration. He made, so-called stopping gun trafficking into Mexico a top priority, yet he claims he knew nothing about Fast and Furious, has been unwilling to give any interviews about this specifically, dodges the question anytime he's asked about it. But you make the connections between Bill Newell, who was the special agent in charge of the ATF Phoenix office, was exchanging emails with White House National Security Advisor Kevin O'Reilly about Operation Fast and Furious. As soon as we found that out, it just so happens that Kevin O'Reilly is shipped overseas to Iraq, where he is unavailable for an interview in front of Congress. And another national security advisor who was briefed on Operation Fast and Furious, his position was national advisor and senior advisor to Latin America for President Obama. Wow. So this idea that he didn't know anything, it's inconceivable that he wouldn't know, considering he made it a top priority. He, has a very anti-Second Amendment viewpoints. He put people around him to carry out his vision, and now he's acting as if he's guilty, not innocent, and not being forthcoming with information. Even after Eric Holder, his attorney general, has changed his testimony multiple times under oath in front of Congress, President Obama is saying, I stand with full faith and confidence with how Eric Holder has handled this situation.
Wow. I am almost breathless. The few interviews get me speechless. This is one of them. And it's put out by Rigoneri Publishing. Let me encourage you to get a copy of this. This is happening as we speak. And it's mysteriously going away from the front pages as we head towards this election cycle. And you probably have seen Katie. She's been on Fox Business, MSNBC, and now she really has arrived. She's on theDove TV. Katie, nice to have you back. This is just so mind-boggling to me. Is the bottom line motivation of this whole scandal to go after the Second Amendment?
Absolutely. I mean, that is exactly what this is. You talk to anyone in law enforcement, whether it's ATF agents, local police officers, they don't let guns walk. This is not a tactic that has ever been used before. This is something that gets people killed. Nothing about what they did, what they claim their motives were, and what the angle were make any sense whatsoever. The evidence shows this was all about pushing a political agenda. And unfortunately, this isn't fiction. It might sound like it, but there are hundreds of dead people here because of this administration's willingness to what they would call sacrifice a few for the greater good of what they think is a better America with more gun control regulations.
Unbelievable. All right, so where are we going with this from here? What I'm hearing you say is probably not going to get much press between now and November, even though it should. And by the way, Governor Romney's out saying, look, President Obama is after your guns. Sounds like he really is.
Well, look, I actually think that this could get a lot of traction. Over the weekend, Mitt Romney gave a speech, and he actually mentioned Fast and Furious for the first time on a presidential level. It was mentioned once in a single Republican debate during the primary season, but that was it. But the idea that Mitt Romney decided to bring it up in his first general election speech as the most likely GOP nominee is a huge deal. And then CNN followed up on that comment that Fast and Furious was used to attack Second Amendment rights of law-abiding Americans. His advisors, doubled down on that and said, look, Operation Fast and Furious can be pointed to as an example of how the Obama administration in the first term has attacked Second Amendment rights. So wow. It depends on where it goes. If the American people make this an issue, which they absolutely should, like I keep saying, people have been killed here. The idea that it's now been brought into the conversation and the rhetoric of a general election is a huge deal.
Well, Katie, if this got tentacles all the way up through the Justice Department, then how in the world can we ever bring this to justice?
Well, that's the key, right? Encouraging, getting behind Chairman Issa and his calls for contempt charges against Eric Holder, and really being supportive of the idea that if you don't believe that the Attorney General of the United States, the President of the United States, and any other of these government officials or employees that were involved in this scandal aren't above the law, you have to read this book, you have to know the details of this, and you have to demand answers.
All right. Now, we all know that as we go in this election cycle, immigration is going to be an issue, but is the drug cartel along the border going to be an issue?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like I said in the previous segment, I've been down there. If you talk to these agents who are working on the ground there, local sheriff's departments, the funny thing that they say is, look, the federal government acts like this is all their job, but illegal immigration is really a local issue, because when something happens on the border, or something happens in a canyon, or someone gets robbed, they don't call the federal government. They call their local police department. They call their sheriff's department. And now that they have to worry about these thugs who are willing to do anything to get their dope loads across the border, and looking at what they do, the horrific crimes they commit in Mexico, beheadings, putting people in acid. I mean, it's so gruesome. The idea that the government now has armed them with firepower that most local police stations don't even have, SWAT team style arming, is amazing. And you can guarantee that, the local law enforcement and law enforcement in general doesn't feel very supported by Attorney General Eric Holder, who claims that he's on their side.
Now, is it true that certain parts of the border that there are even signs and certainly advice that you stay away so many miles, and even farmers now can't even farm their land because of the danger?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's parts. So, for example, Casa Grande, Arizona, which is in between Tucson and Phoenix, that's all run with cartel money, and ranchers and farmers that have been there for years. These cartels run drugs up and down right next to their farms. I mean, and I'm not saying right next to in the sense of a mile down the road. I mean, right next to their farms, these guys are running up and down, and a lot of them wear bulletproof vests. They don't let their kids walk outside without them being there. And yes, the government, and under Janet Napolitano, her solution was, we're going to put up these signs that say, caution, illegal smuggling activity may occur here. I mean, is that a joke or what? And they've also had to shut down certain parts of Arizona because they were so violent. We had a rancher killed there a couple of years ago. Still haven't had any justice for him. And the problem is, once again, look, this isn't about can't, it's about will not. They're perfectly capable of putting the National Guard, some kind of military presence on the border, and all this cartel activity will stop. They don't respect law enforcement, but they do respect the U.S. military.
All right, Katie, do you think anybody will go to jail? I mean, are most of these people involved somewhat under the protection of the administration? And if the administration is changed out in November, could they still go back and get these people and bring them to justice?
They could, and people need to demand that happen. It's typical of, an administration going out to kind of be allowed to just move on without consequences for their actions. But this is so horrific, so horrific that people have been killed because of a policy motive, that I would hope that the next president would at least hold responsible those who have perjured themselves in front of Congress, and for those responsible for coming up with this idea of allowing guns to be given to these straw purchasers and taken to Mexico, where they were going to be used in murders, and then obviously taken back across into Mexico and being used for murders as well and violent crimes.
Wow. Katie, thank you. Your passion is incredible. Thank you for your book. And, let's stay in touch as this thing begins to get a little closer. And especially when these people are brought to justice, I want to have you back. I want to see that frown go to a smile.
Yes, me too. And I hope that we can get some answers for the Terry family and also for the family of Jaime Zapata as well.
All right. Thank you, Katie. God bless you. Hang in there.
Thank you.